You're listening to the Hayek Program podcast. This podcast includes audio from lectures, interviews, and discussions from scholars and visitors of the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. To learn more about the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. To learn about graduate student fellowship opportunities with the Mercatus Center at George Mason University for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org.
I'm Stephanie Hafley, the Deputy Director of Academic and Student Programs and a Senior Fellow with the F.A. Hayek Program for Advanced Study in Philosophy, Politics, and Economics at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. About a year and a half ago, the Hayek Program started a research project on work and dependency to explore the notion and philosophy of work and the responsibility and challenges associated with welfare provided by individuals, civil society, and government. To better understand these topics and find ways to encourage and support scholarship in this arena, we wanted to focus on the changing technology, norms, opportunities, and challenges of today and tomorrow. We are honored to be able to partner with the Niskanen Center, particularly Samuel Hammond, the Director of Poverty and Welfare Policy, to put on this conference on the future of work. We also hope this is just the beginning of the conversation. Technological innovation is a driving factor of economic growth that both disrupts current practices and creates new opportunities. As a society, we tend to both yearn for and caution against technological change, and economists, policymakers, and the general public have an interest in how technology will impact our society. What is the role of markets, civil society, and government in shaping the future of work and technology? What does social scientific and policy analysis have to say about these changing dynamics? And how do those social scientists and policy analysts interested in promoting an open society seek to understand and suggest democratic solutions to collective challenges that treat citizens as dignified equals? As part of this conference on the future of work, there were 4 keynote lectures to kick off the discussion. It is my honor to introduce Elizabeth Rhodes. Elizabeth Rhodes is the research director for the Basic Income Project at Y Combinator Research. Prior to joining Y Combinator Research, she completed a joint PhD in social work and political science at the University of Michigan in 2016, where her research focused on health and education provisions of informal settlements, workforce development, and poverty prevention and alleviation strategies. Her talk today is on a 21st century vision for economic security.
Thank you. I'm really excited to be here. I've learned a lot, great presentations. I think one of the bad things about going last is that a lot of very brilliant and better spoken people talked about a lot of things in greater detail that I was going to touch on. But so we'll consider part of my presentation a high-level summary of some things we've gone through, and then I am going to talk quite a bit about our project. So I work for Y Combinator Research, and I had not actually heard of it when I saw my job posting 3.5 years ago, but Y Combinator is a startup accelerator that invests in, mentors, and trains young companies. YC was launched in March of 2005, and it is consistently ranked as one of the top accelerators. The mentorship and training aspect is what really separates it from venture capital. And a lot of Silicon Valley's sort of hot companies, including Airbnb, Dropbox, Reddit, and Stripe, have gone through YC. Although they're often conflated, Y Combinator Research, or YCR, where I work, is actually a completely separate organization. We are a nonprofit research lab established in 2015 by Sam Altman, who at that time was the president of Y Combinator. He founded YCR to address problems that startups either aren't set up to, can't solve, the incentive structures aren't there, and types of projects that have a longer time horizon that maybe aren't being tackled in traditional research settings such as academia. As an organization, we seek to consider how technological advances affect social outcomes, to think more broadly about how to minimize the negative effects, and to promote a more equitable distribution of the benefits across individuals and communities. So it's sort of natural that basic income is one of YCR's first projects. And an experiment and a call for researchers was announced in early 2016. Now, Sam's interest in basic income grew out of his work with Y Combinator, but also out of his work with OpenAI, which he co-founded around the same time that YCR was founded. It was OpenAI, the goal is to develop artificial general intelligence with a focus on safety and similar to YCR, sort of seeing that the benefits are more equitably distributed, more evenly distributed, and that the technology isn't necessarily owned by one company. It was founded as a nonprofit, but earlier this year they started sort of the nonprofit still exists, but there is a capped profit organization, OpenAI LP, operating alongside of it, fully governed by the nonprofit side. But they learned quickly that in order to compete with Google and other tech giants with this sort of safety and more community-driven mission, they needed more money. So through his work with YC, Sam was seeing firsthand how companies are increasingly able to do more with less, to shift the production function, as we've talked about. And through his experience with OpenAI, he really believes and can envision a future where many of the current jobs, or certainly parts of the current jobs, can be done better and cheaper by technology. So the likelihood of mass job loss in the future may have spurred Sam's interest in basic income. But then he hired me, a poverty researcher, who was focused on the shortcomings of the existing social safety net and the challenges facing low-wage workers. So we took on a slightly different dimension in some ways. We've sort of combined the visions. So I'm going to go through the next slides fairly quickly, because we've been talking about these statistics in depth throughout most of this conference. So one of the things that we've seen is the benefits of economic growth are increasingly unevenly distributed. I think looking at growth since 1980, the GDP has grown at like 154%. Incomes of the top 1% have grown at 190%, but the median household income has only grown by 16.5%. Income inequality has also steadily risen. So this is using data from Piketty and colleagues. They found that, I think it was 2015, I'm not sure the last year in this data set, but the share of total income in the US earned by the top 10% exceeded the total combined income of the bottom 90%. And I think this paper, we've talked about a couple times as well, but Raj Chetty and colleagues, they found this precipitous decline in intergenerational mobility. In 1940, it was around 90% of children ended up earning more than their parents, and for the cohort born in the 1980s, that has dropped significantly to only about half of people. And Betsy talked about this yesterday and did point out that slowing GDP growth contributes to this, but we do definitely see reduced mobility. So these income and wealth changes are driven in part by the changing nature of jobs in the US. So this graph looks at job growth, percent change in non-farm employment, so payroll employment between the 1960s and 2015. And so on average, over the decades, 1960s to the 90s, there was on average about a 25% increase in payroll employment per decade. We saw a decrease there during the Great Recession, and then between 2005 and 2015, the increase was only 6.5%. And in a 2016 paper, Larry Katz and Alan Kruger report that while during that period from 2005 to 2015, there were 9.1 million more people employed, there were also 9.4 million more people employed in what they call alternative work arrangements. That could be contractor work, freelance, gig employment. And essentially what they concluded was that suggests that most entirely all new job growth is going to these alternative arrangements. And that's not inherently bad. I mean, contract and gig employment can be great. We've talked about it. They allow individuals, can allow individuals more flexibility and autonomy, but they can also create a lot of volatility in income, a lot of uncertainty about future employment, and they frequently lack benefits, such as paid sick leave and health care. In fact, and this was a 2016 report by JP Morgan Chase Institute, and they had used anonymized data from 1 million Chase customers. They found that more than half of people experience a more than 30% month-to-month change in income. And among individuals in the bottom income quintile, that figure is 74%. And volatility is also quite high among individuals ages 18 to 24, which is something we might expect given life trajectories at that time. But according to that report, 86% of the month-to-month volatility actually comes from variation in pay within one job, whether it's pay frequency, like changes in hours, seasonal bonuses and things like that. About the same over the time period, I think about 4 in 10 people change jobs, and so the change in job accounts for about 10% or 14% of the observed volatility. So amid this increasing economic security, the existing safety net isn't sufficient. I mean, it's critical, and it does decrease poverty by about half. I think these figures are a couple years ago, but it decreased poverty from about 26.6% to 14.3%. But that still leaves 14.3% of people in poverty, many of whom are children. And the current safety net is a very complex patchwork of programs. Many people are categorically ineligible for aid. They're unaware of their eligibility for benefits. Take-up is low. Navigating the bureaucracy is difficult. And many of the programs also have work disincentives built in. So, benefits phase out as income increases, and sometimes that phase out is quite, dramatic. And that earning that extra dollar and losing a benefit that, is incredibly valuable, maybe a child care voucher, doesn't make sense economically. And I thought I understood this complexity, having been trained as a social worker, but it wasn't until I started working on this project and trying to figure out how cash transfers would affect people's existing benefits, and could we get exemptions. I was working in several states. It is incredibly difficult to understand and interpret the regulations, even for someone who's PhD in social work, and for a lot of the people whose job it is to sort of enforce these regulations. We go to, high level at, departments of health and human services, and they say, I don't know, like maybe figure out a way. If you can find a loophole, then, okay. And it's just really, really complicated. We actually had to pass a law, or help. I didn't pass it, but we got help passing a law in one state to protect people's benefits so they didn't lose them. We'll talk more about that. So many of these trends, sort of the growth of alternative work arrangements, increasing volatility, and as Betsy highlighted yesterday, the shift in employment from like manufacturing and goods producing sectors to the service sector aren't categorically like detrimental or bad. A lot of people, especially people with higher skills and education, benefit enormously from this. Wages have risen, income has gone up. And I think one of the statistics that maybe is questionable, but I just read a paper about using labor market data from the UK, local labor markets. I think it's from 2009 to 2015, and they found that for every 10 sort of high-tech jobs, so STEM-intensive, technology-related jobs, the digital economy, they found that 7 local non-tradable jobs, so not easily able to be sent to another country, and 6 of those went to low-skill workers. So they actually found an increase in sort of low-skill jobs. Depends on what figure you look at and things like that. But there are a lot of sort of low-wage, low-skill jobs out there. But the jobs are often poorly paid, service work, and they see average wages fall. Even when wages increase, we have a context, the context is we have like large increases in the cost of housing, healthcare, childcare, which largely offset any gains in wages. So there are middle skill workers being displaced from fairly well-paying, stable, secure manufacturing jobs. In the future, more and more people who fall into this category could face similar circumstances. There's a lot of talk about truck drivers, and it's a fairly well-paying job, and what happens, they either left to retrain and pursue further education or fill a low-skill job, many of which really don't pay enough to offer any sort of economic security. It is possible to work full-time in this country and still have an income at or below the poverty line. So the problem of economic insecurity isn't just a problem of the future for if and when mass automation leads to mass job losses. And so far, this has been going on, these trends, we've seen, for decades, but so far we've resisted making any significant policy changes. I know there is some skepticism about whether the technological advancements will actually materialize as predicted. No one wants to think that their job or their task can be automated. And a lot of the discourse around the future of work is focused on that long-run disruption. What happens if there are only jobs for a fraction of the population? But when I think of basic income in that context, it's actually problematic for reasons many people have brought up during this conference. Work as a vehicle for economic self-sufficiency, self-actualization, and structure, both our daily schedule and structure over the course of the lifespan, is deeply interwoven into the social and cultural fabric of our society. Even if work doesn't provide some or all of those things for many people, society tells us that it should. And when it doesn't, it tends to be more of our fault, and that leads to a lot of psychological challenges. So, as Michael Caine discussed yesterday, and also Joe mentioned with Wally, both long-term, the experiences of those who have been long-term unemployed forced unemployment, don't paint a great picture of life without work. So if economic security is to be partially or even completely decoupled from employment, our social expectations and norms are going to have to change as well. But what I want to focus on is more of the short term. So historically, we have weathered what Keynes referred to as the painfulness of readjustment between one economic period and another. The most dire predictions during the agricultural and industrial revolutions weren't necessarily borne out, and the advancements have made us much better off as a whole. So in a more optimistic view of the long run, jobs, don't go away. They evolve, they change. The labor market might not be able to provide enough jobs that allow people to support themselves. It doesn't today. That's already here. And so economic security may have to be, partially decoupled from paid employment. But work can be defined more broadly and undertaken more for its subjective value. As an aside, I think the best job that I ever had, I was a full-time volunteer for 3 years. I made $65 a month and would really still be in that job if it had a pension plan or if I was able to save on that $65. I think you never know exactly what would happen. But I think during these previous short-term disruptions and these shifts, it is important to note that while on the whole we emerged better off, not everyone emerged unscathed, and many groups and individuals were left out, systematically even of the post-war boom. And Betsy did talk yesterday about sort of the development of this underclass, and the share that could be left behind this time could be even larger. So I think the question is, the more immediate question is, how do we deal with this short-run disruption? And so to think about this, I want to turn to sort of the ubiquitous quadrant module, just as a thought exercise. So on the x-axis, we have the pace of technological change, or it could be more accurately like the adoption of change. So, and then, whether it's slow or fast. And on the y-axis, we'll have sort of the degree of shared prosperity from low to high. And just a big disclaimer to start off, this model is highly stylized and very simplified, and there are a lot of assumptions baked in. But my goal really is to get us to step back and not think about specific policies first, but about a vision for weathering those short-term disruptions. So in the lower left quadrant, we have what could be, if all the assumptions hold, the status quo. Either the technological advancements aren't realized as soon as people predict, or, we can, add regulations that will sort of impede the adoption of these and limit the adoption to protect existing jobs, to limit the number that it's eliminated. With that, we don't see the reduction in the cost of goods, the increased efficiency that we could see with the technology, but you have fewer jobs lost. But at the same time, our social safety net is inadequate. It leaves more and more people in poverty. And the ongoing decreases in the quality and security of jobs, absent adequate regulations, will further erode the middle class. And long run, with fewer people able to afford the goods and services we're producing, we could see economic growth slow. At the same time, inequality will continue to grow if we don't do any, make any changes, and so economic mobility will decrease. As Betsy noted yesterday, a portion of that decrease in intergenerational mobility is due to slowing growth. And so absence of any change, we would expect to see that trend continue and maybe even increase. So then on the lower right quadrant, we have maybe the maximum disruption and sort of welfare losses that many people are left behind, sort of more of the dystopian vision for some. So we could see these widespread adoption of technological advancements could lead to mass manual labor and professional job losses. This is at the extreme. Governments, if we don't make any changes in policy, we don't adopt a new safety net. We are ensuring that the benefits of economic growth are captured by a small portion of the population. And one of the things that I've learned from being tangentially connected to OpenAI is that the resources involved and necessary, the startup costs, the barriers to entry are so high. I mean, the amount of money that is spent on just computing power, much less paying people and everything else, is like astronomical. And so, I think as this becomes sort of the technology of the future, you're going to see increasingly like concentrated, in just a few companies, and that, that concentration of wealth and income is going to really increase. Economic growth can be fueled by these technological advancements and generate enormous wealth, but again, if fewer people are able to afford those goods and services, who's going to buy them and what's going to happen in the long run? Jobs change, as we've talked about. There will be new sectors of the economy we can't even imagine yet, but retraining is limited to those who can afford it. When I was a grad student at Michigan, I worked on the development of Governor Granholm's No Worker Left Behind program. And I got to work on it like sort of the very early stages and think about what it was she wanted to offer 2 years free community college tuition to any displaced worker if they would retrain for employment or education in an in-demand field. So I set about, trying to figure out, okay, all the supports that people would need and how to make this maximally successful. And, came up with a long list of recommendations, none of which were ever adopted. They did just do the straight 2 years free community college tuition. And, it was cut short when she left office, so evaluations of it, like rigorous evaluations of it, are really sketchy. I've not been able to see much. But, I mean, anecdotally and based on surveys, you saw that it was really difficult. I mean, people, they had to work multiple jobs to support their families. Taking time off to go back to school, even though it was free, was really difficult. So the people who benefited tended to be better off, and also there wasn't a lot of remedial support. So they, people have been like long out of school, and so it was, people who are better prepared anyway were the ones that tend to benefit. So, I mean, even if we do put in sort of, have great retraining opportunities, they're not necessarily going to be equitably distributed and available to all. And, as this sort of situation could further, create more divisions in our society and threaten institutions, as Betsy talked about yesterday. So then, in the upper left quadrant, we could sort of say the government gets more involved in sort of redistributing income. So if growth or if adoption is fairly slow, we either because the technology doesn't develop or of regulation, there's a limit to the number of jobs eliminated. But then there are additional policies that can improve the quality and the security of existing low-wage and contract jobs, and they can provide retraining opportunities, so fewer people are left behind in that way. We could expect maybe that today's pace of economic growth continues, maybe stagnates. We don't get that that massive benefit from technology, and government takes a more active role in redistributing resources to reduce inequality. And then finally, we have sort of the short-run utopian vision, I think. So where the adoption of these rapid technological advancements bring down the cost of living and provide unprecedented access to goods and services. Economic growth is fueled by technological advancements. We generate this enormous wealth, but governments and civil society ensure that those gains benefit all citizens by building some sort of new social safety net or new mechanism for redistribution. Jobs change, but the availability of education and retraining and coupled with security provided by the safety net or some form of redistribution allows more and more people to be brought along to flourish. So that seems like where we want to be, but there isn't really a clear policy path roadmap for how to get there. So basic income is one policy option that has been proposed as a way of building a new safety net and redistributing the gains from technological advancement. Interest in basic income has skyrocketed lately, and many have expressed very strong opinions for and against it. But the debate often relies heavily on conjecture, stereotypes, and out-of-date studies. We have very little evidence for how a basic income would work in the US in the 21st century. Moreover, it's not a singular policy prescription. There are so many ways it could be structured and paid for. I mean, we talk about a wealth tax, a sovereign wealth fund, an income tax. All of those decisions could have an enormous effect on the incentive structures and then the outcomes. So it's not just one idea. So we're going to conduct an experiment. I want to note at the outset that one study can't even begin to answer all the questions that we have about basic income. And a small pilot, cannot simulate a long-term policy change. In many ways, it's a first step. We've designed the study to explore questions relevant to a wide range of potential policies to maximize its usefulness to academics, policymakers. It is in many ways an exploratory study. And I guess one of the first reactions I get is, why bother? Why spend the money? Nothing's going to change. We're not there yet. It's not going to happen. And I think the reason that we're undertaking this now, at a time when transformative policy change does not look imminent, is to be proactive. So many policies and social programs are much more reactive. They don't address a problem until many people's lives have been upended, and then it's more of a Band-Aid than a sustainable solution and a sustainable response to the problem. And basic income is not a silver bullet. We want to learn about the conditions under which it is helpful and for whom. We have an opportunity to, develop a vision for the future and to experiment so that future policies are based on evidence. We can innovate, test, and scale. And, hopefully we can identify some of those unintended consequences and, ineffectiveness to either sort of retool or have ideas to inform a policy or say, we need to go in a different direction. Whether or not basic income is a viable solution, we hope that the study will offer valuable insight that can be effective, to figure out what will be effective in the long run. So briefly, we talk about basic income there's a lot of talk, and many of the benefits that people cite. One is, you could just by setting an income floor, a guaranteed income, you could, eradicate poverty as it's currently defined. You can foster growth by promoting investments in human capital and increasing purchasing power. You can spark entrepreneurship. People are able to, I think YC talks is basically a basic income in some ways. They give you $12,500, allowing you to quit your job and start thinking about your company. Not everyone has this idea, as I constantly tell them I'm one of the more risk-averse people on the planet and would never do that, but it could create that opportunity. And it gives people the freedom to define their lives. People are trapped often in a cycle of low-wage work. There's a book by Jennifer Silva who looks at sort of working class young adults, and many of whom actually went to college, but you see they're just sort of trapped in this, they had to take the first low-wage job that was out there because they didn't have the resources. They couldn't move home. Their parents couldn't support them while they figured out what they wanted to do. And so the need to pay today's rent meant that they took the first job available. They're sort of on this cycle. They're not using their college degree. They have these enormous loans. So how do we sort of give people more freedom to define their lives? It gives people more opportunity, could give people more opportunity for civic and social engagement, create time to volunteer in your communities if you work a little bit less, if you have some of that stress relieved so that you can actually think about what you might want to be doing with your time. And it could reduce the complexity of the social assistance programs. So the question for us was, how do you design a study that could begin to even test some of whether these impacts are actually realized? And one of the things that we were really interested in at first, in the beginning, is taking on a very holistic study. So if you look back at the negative income tax experiments and other sort of basic income-like studies, the focus has really been on sort of the labor market response and these very economic responses, very economic outcomes. And we want to take a much more holistic approach to people's lives. I think it's been one of the interesting things during the conference as we've talked about work as that affects different dimensions of our lives. And I think that's one of the things we want to explore in the study. And so to start with, we put together a really amazing team of primary investigators and advisors. Our team of primary investigators are all junior faculty. It's been wonderful to work with them. We have weekly calls. We have, academic advisors that are very esteemed, from many disciplines, from both academia, from think tanks. It's a really great group, and they've been very helpful. And I think, together we've sort of crafted this research design, which we're actually implementing as we speak. I've actually been running out. We've got 40 interviewers in the field enrolling people, and so some questions have come up, but we're implementing it now. And I think, it is an interesting model. My first question in my interview was, why don't you give the money to an academic, or an existing institution that's set up, to run studies like this? And, the answer was we want to try a different model. It is somewhat of a hybrid. We go through an institutional review board. We have, strong ties to academia, but we are, very independent. And to Sam and the funders' credit is they've sort of said, here, you design the study. I've had complete and total independence with, our partners to, develop this. We're able to, I've talked, my first weeks on the job, I actually talked with some of the people that were involved in designing the negative income tax studies in the US in the 60s and 70s. And one of the things they said is, there were 26 different groups all trying to get their survey questions in, and there was disagreements about what's going to be in what the focus is, what the research questions are. That also came up a lot when I talked with people working on a study in Canada that eventually got canceled for political reasons, and in Finland. And so the opportunity to sort of be insulated from that and to be able to craft what we hope is sort of a unified study that actually is designed to answer some of the questions we're asking, we hope, is really unique. There have been challenges. doing it outside of government. We had to pass that law, as we mentioned. So, there are pros and cons to the model. So, sort of what we've been under, it's taken a while. It's really actually a lot more complicated than you might think to give away money. So we started with just, a very small N of 6 feasibility study that ran for a year. We gave away I think people received $1,500 a month for a year. And really this was just to begin to test out, how do we deliver payments? The people were amazing. We talked a lot of, especially after the fact, talking through, what were some of the challenges for them? What are some of those unintended consequences? How do we mitigate those in the study and moving forward? We then took all that back and started, working on developing this sort of research instruments and the protocol for the study. Then we did another operational pilot so the Survey Research Center at the University of Michigan is involved in helping enroll people. So they actually piloted this out. We people received much smaller amounts of money, but we had 100 people over a longer period of time to check out test instruments, check response rates to surveys and things like that. And this main study, which I'm going to talk about, is being launched this year. So it is a randomized controlled trial being conducted in 2 different states. There'll be 3,000 participants, active participants. I'll talk a little bit more about that in the next slide. The treatment group will receive $1,000 per month for 3 years. And we're limiting it to individuals ages 21 to 40, partly because we expect that a basic income or these unconditional cash transfers would have a different effect across the life cycle. And we don't have unlimited funds, and in order to, we had to make some decisions about where to focus. And so we focused on age, and then we also put an income cap at where household income doesn't exceed 300% of the federal poverty level for their household size. And we have sort of stratification targets to ensure that our sample is representative racially, with gender, within that. So we have 0 to 100% of the federal poverty level, 100 to 200, and 200 to 300. So we have distribution across that. And then once we are actually doing random assignment to treatment control, we'll do balance checks on a number of using baseline survey data to make sure that we don't have all the unemployed people in the treatment group, for example, and all the people with children and massive amounts of debt. So we will be doing some of those and re-randomizing if necessary. And I think one of the more unique things that we're trying to do is, because we'll be interacting with people, even the control group receives $50 a month, and so they're interacting with us, they receive a small amount of money. So we wanted to create a larger control group that doesn't ever receive any interaction, to see if that $50 and that, what the effect of that is. And so we're trying to recruit random sample of 10,000 eligible people, so who respond to our recruitment, to random addresses, agree to participate, and then the first stage of randomization will be 7,000 will be into the administrative data control group. So we ask permission to access their admin data, which I'll talk more about a little bit later. And then we never, interact with them again. And then 3,000 people will be randomized into the active participation, the program as we're calling it. So then, we attempt enrollment baseline survey. After that it actually it's going to take about 8 to 9 months to enroll 3,000 people. Then we'll do the second randomization into the treatment and control group. And then at that point, the different payments will start. And, I think we're really actively trying to take a mixed method approach to this study. So we do have, it is, its heart, quantitative RCT, looking at, what happens when individuals receive $1,000 a month for 3 years. So we have, defined narrow research questions, specific measurable outcomes. We have this large sample to hopefully be powered to detect effects. data sources for this are surveys, administrative data, and for consenting individuals, financial transaction data, which I'll also talk about. But then, that sort of shows correlations between receiving this money and these outcomes, but we really want to understand not only that, but the mechanisms, like what's underlying those effects, what's really going on, because in many ways this is an exploratory study, and we might learn more from the qualitative than we do from the quantitative. We're upfront about that. So there'll be a subsample of 200 people that will be followed much more intensively over the time period, 2 in-person, open-ended interviews a year. Here we can look more at, these, the broad questions, the mechanisms of impact, and the constraints and challenges people face. And we can also use those interviews to, it'll be a sort of a iterative approach. So as we get data back from each wave of data collection, in the quantitative, if we see patterns that are confusing, we can try to, structure our instruments to try to understand what's going on there. So in terms of what kind of data we're using, there's a mixture of sort of active and passive data. So we'll be doing 3 in-person surveys during the course of the study. So 1 at baseline, 1 at midline, and 1 at endline. Each one's about 45 minutes long. We have, we're not doing, a lot of biometrics, but we are just, measuring height, weight, and blood pressure as indicators of future disease. And then, there's a lot of focus on the scarcity hypothesis, how having scarcity of whether it's time or money leads to short-sighted decisions. And so one of the things we are measuring cognitive function, I don't really love that term. It's more sort of inhibitory control and attention. So we do have those sort of tasks to see if, try to get at sort of bandwidth to see, if people are able to, better have a little bit more bandwidth to think about the future and plan for the future. And, there's questions about, do these tests actually measure that? But we're going to measure it anyway. We really want to collect more granular data. So we have these short, and we didn't know if it was possible, but it worked really well in the pilot. We had response rates of about 90% over the course of a year. So we have very short, about 10-minute monthly web-based, we use Qualtrics surveys, just kind of check in. I'll talk a little bit more about them in a second. And we also have a mobile app that was created with a couple of small activities. So monthly surveys, we're trying to get at data or outcomes that change a lot more frequently, so we have repeated measures of. And I think a lot of the existing sort of large-scale survey data on things like labor market, like employment, consumption, it's all based on this once a year, how much did you spend on this a month last year, or how many jobs did you have? And it doesn't really, we've found, capture sort of the nuance of people's lives now. And so we really want to try to document that during the study. So we have these monthly surveys, and we wanted to measure, I'll talk about the outcomes in just a second, but one of the things is time use. And so we had this app created where, people, for a day or 2 a month, they can sort of drag and drop to try to make it less onerous than some of the time diaries that exist. We also have, the STRIP test, which measures sort of inhibitory control and attention, and some of the time and risk preferences or activities that people can do in the app. And then, we have a lot of data that we're collecting passively. So if response rates plummet, we will still have data on a lot of outcomes. So the circles sort of have the different types of admin data that we hope to collect. Our university partners have data sharing agreements in some cases, and others we're still working on it. But that could be credit bureaus for financial data, participation in other public benefit programs, births, deaths, education records, looking at things like attendance, test scores, disciplinary action. And this financial transaction data. So if people do consent to share transactions, it doesn't show what they purchase, but through sort of a massive big data set, sort of analyze general consumption patterns. And so what are we trying to measure? The short answer is everything. But, it's like once in a, I think, we're giving away about $49 million directly to individuals. So we want to get as much out of it as we can. So one of the, I'll go through them fairly quickly. I will note that we are soon, they're almost done, we'll be posting our pre-analysis plans. So we'll have it sort of in depth about how we're, the metrics we're using and how we're collecting the data. But I think one of the things we're looking at is subjective and psychological well-being, sort of satisfaction, affect, self-determination, interpersonal relationships and social support, and social integration. Also material well-being, so housing and neighborhood quality. Are people able to, move to a different neighborhood or dwelling that offers more space or less noise? Material hardship, food security, and nutrition. We're doing some nutrition diaries, and transportation security, which is not necessarily the biggest issue in an inner city, but we are also sampling in suburban and rural areas as well. Health is another, so both physical and mental health. So we're looking at, as I said, we looked at sort of the Oregon Medicaid study and other studies that have looked at health, and with this younger group and our sample size, we're unlikely to see, significant differences in sort of health outcomes. So we're really trying to look at some of the inputs that may be indicators of future health outcomes. So, healthcare access, preventative care, utilization, stress is a big one, healthy and / unhealthy behaviors, health investments, exercise, sleep, as well as sort of self-reported health and mental health. And I think one thing is we talk about the expense, and I'm really this is a very much of a micro level study, and I'm not talking about sort of the macro effects, but I think, one of the things that they found in the Canadian negative income tax studies is that the healthcare costs went way down. I mean, there were fewer injuries, fewer hospitalizations. And so when we talk about the cost of a program like this, looking at where might be savings, and so I think that's one of the things we're also trying to gather data on. And financial health, so income, the other income and income volatility, consumption and expenditures, savings, investments. I think one of the most difficult things about this measuring those is that whether it goes up or down, people could save more, and that's great. They're saving. Savings could also go down because they made a productive investment. So a lot of it on some of these outcomes, you could sort of see a null result, and we don't, it could be judged. So really understanding what's happening with the qualitative and even with the way that we've structured our survey questions, and we're hoping to get at some of that. Financial behavior, does this allow people to not have to resort to payday loans or other costly financial products? And financial health and resilience, I think, is a big one. If we give people more money, they're going to have more money. But I think the question is, it's like, half of Americans can't deal with a $400 emergency unexpected expense. And so are people better able to cope with economic shocks, like healthcare emergencies, without having to file for bankruptcy or just completely upending their financial lives? I think time use is a big one, and it sort of encapsulates a lot of what we've been talking about and a lot of the other sort of types of outcomes. So labor market participation is one. Do people work less? I think one of the big criticisms of other studies and what we can't get at is we are only seeing sort of the supply of labor. We don't know what would happen. We can't measure the demand side. We're also doing a geographically dispersed sample, so there's not a lot we can get at, but we will look at, not only do people work more or less, but they work different jobs. Do they take maybe a lower paying job that they find more meaningful? That type of thing. So any type of education or training, doesn't have to be like a formal program, but are people working to gain new skills? Certainly childcare, elder care, are parents able to spend more time with kids? Civic engagement and volunteering, and leisure. And those are just some of the categories. And then again, I've sort of touched on this, but some of the employment outcomes in terms of number and type of jobs, hours worked, like the stability of those jobs and of the income, job quality and satisfaction, and meaning in work. So we're using the work as work as meaning inventory, and really trying to understand people's relationship to their job, and are there correlations between that and job changes and other things like that, as well as sort of entrepreneurial orientation, activity, and intention. And then looking some at these decision-making outcomes, these time and risk preferences. So as I mentioned before, inhibitory control and attention, trying to get at the scarcity hypothesis. Time preferences, like present bias, like risk preferences, those type of outcomes. And for child outcomes, I think right now, based on about half of our very small portion of the sample, about half of them have children, and they're not all the same age, so we're not going to be powered to, say much about these massive child outcomes, but we are going to collect information on sort of the home environment, parental involvement, non-parental care, and educational outcomes, as well as health of children. And then there's some sort of other, I just kind of stuck in, looking at mobility. I mean, I think one of the, a lot of proponents of basic income talk about the ability to say, I'm in San Francisco or I'm in the Bay Area because my job is there, but it takes all my entire income just to afford rent, and my family's really far away, and I would rather, if given the opportunity, I would rather not do that. So would basic income allow people to move? In a short-term study, unlikely, we don't know if we'll see that, but as I'll talk about in briefly a case study from a pilot, we did see that, even with a one-year study. So then there's David Brockman as a political scientist on our team, and he's looking a lot at political participation and engagement, as well as sort of these social and political attitudes about work, views of redistribution, other regarding preferences, and things like that. Okay, so I want to close by just talking, it's totally anecdotal. Again, we had a N of 6 for this, but just 2 stories from our feasibility study that illustrate sort of the breadth of the potential effects of basic income. So Brianna, at the time when we enrolled her, she was working a part-time seasonal job in Oakland. She was kind of couch surfing, staying with family, and a couple months after she started receiving the basic income, she was able to move to a sort of a distant suburb where the cost of living is lower. She got an apartment. She was able to use the proof that she was going to receive this for the next year to help her sign on a lease. She got a full-time 9-to-5 job. Just that sort of income gave her the stability she needed to sort of reevaluate and take steps to do that. She also in this place where she moved, some of her brother and his children lived there, and she was able to spend a lot of time caring for them and also invest in some of their food and clothing and help out. And then on the the other side, we had what are we calling her again? Irene. She was a student, and she came from a low-income background. She didn't have any family support. She was working multiple part-time jobs just to work through school. And she was able to quit some of those and focus more on her school work, which was great. But she also started a band. She pursued some other, she's very busy, but pursued some other artistic endeavors. She volunteered for local government, and she is in the Bay Area. She became involved in the activist community. And she said that at first, we said, talking about it, how did this affect you? And she was kind of like, well, I don't know. And then she sort of stepped back, and she's like, actually, it just gave her a whole new outlook. And it actually changed what she plans to do in the future. And I do not think that this is going to be transformative in that way for most people. And I think tempering expectations, I think people assume, think $12,000 a year is a ton of money. And it is, but, it's the cost of a decent used car too. It's not, it's not going to allow you to just quit your job and lay around and do nothing. It's a supplement, and for some people, just the ability to pay your bills, just know you can pay your bills this month and have that stability, that sort of reduction in stress or whatever that creates, whatever that opens up, over time could really build up. We might not see it in the study, but we want to try.
Thank you for listening to the Hayek Program podcast. To learn more about the research, scholars, and work of the Hayek Program, visit hayek.mercatus.org. For more information about graduate student fellowship opportunities for students at Mason as well as at universities across the globe, please visit students.mercatus.org. We hope you recommend students to our programs or consider applying yourself.